Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back. Our next speaker is Claire Thomas. And between 2016 and 2019, Claire was based in northern Iraq, covering the country's efforts to defeat ISIS and recover from decades of conflict. In one of the deadliest urban battles since World War II, the war against ISIS in Mosul took a devastating toll on the residents of Iraq's second largest city. Thousands of civilians endured months of trauma, and during the final battle, 9,000 civilians lost their lives. During the final liberation of the city, Claire worked on the front lines photographing volunteer medical professionals as they provided emergency treatment to civilians and military personnel. Claire has been shortlisted for a number of awards for her coverage of the Mosul offensive and is now one of the elite women and men who risk all to document and bear witness to these harrowing events. To show us her work and tell us her remarkable story, please welcome Claire Thomas.
Thank you, Aidan, for the introduction. And thank you, Your Highness, Your Excellencies, and the Exposure team for organizing this superb event. It's really an honor to be standing here today and sharing some of my work and my story with you all. Before I begin, I'd like to show you a short video clip from Iraq. Amid the chaos and intensity of the battle against the so-called Islamic State in the city of Mosul, this little girl was rushed into a field clinic just a few meters behind the front line. During her escape, the child had suffered multiple gunshot wounds and many other injuries that put her on the very edge of survival. Within seconds of arriving at the clinic, Katie Batrouni, a young paramedic from Australia, dressed the child's wounds, stemming the bleeding to buy her some time to reach a hospital. As Katie carried the child out into the street in search of an ambulance, military vehicles screeched to a halt outside the clinic, carrying more and more gravely injured civilians in need of emergency medical care, overwhelming the clinic's few medics and limited resources. In that moment, I decided to set my camera aside and accompany Katie in the ambulance, hoping I might be able to help in some way or at least offer my support. As the ambulance sped along the dusty, abandoned, war-torn streets of western Mosul, the child's terror-filled screams began to weaken until she eventually stopped breathing. With no gurney or medical supplies inside the ambulance, Katie placed the bleeding child onto my lap and instructed me to hold her still while she inserted a needle into her chest, allowing air back into her collapsed lung. As I held the child on my blood-soaked lap, her terrified eyes locked onto mine. I stopped to ask myself, how did I get here? Allow me to take you back to the very beginning of my personal journey into photography and how it led me to the front line. Yes, this is an 11-year-old me on my pony in Wales. I grew up in a tiny village in South Wales called Idole, where from the age of 4, my thoughts and dreams were consumed by one thing: horses. Years later, it was my love of horses that compelled me to pick up a camera. While I was studying politics at university in England, I had the opportunity to spend a summer working as a wrangler on a horse ranch in the mountains of Wyoming in the US. Living out my childhood fantasy of being a cowgirl in a setting and culture I thought existed only in Western movies, I was inspired to take pictures of the beautiful ranch horses against the imposing backdrop of the Wyoming wilderness and the iconic Teton mountain range, part of the world-famous Rocky Mountains. Looking back, my time spent on the ranch actually helped prepare me for the physical demands of working in a war zone. With over 90 horses to feed and take care of, ranch life was extremely physically demanding and tough, much tougher than I'd expected, with very few home comforts and countless hours spent in the saddle, navigating vast mountains and high-altitude deserts, often in extreme temperatures. I soon realized that horses weren't my only passion in life, and I began to fall in love with photography. I then started eagerly reading photography books to teach myself the basics before buying my first SLR camera. After a few years of traveling and taking a lot of pictures, my approach to photography began to change direction during a volunteer project in Ghana. As a 20-something graduate, I traveled to West Africa to work with a community-based organization that supports women living with HIV/AIDS. During the project, although I was there for work unrelated to photography, I took pictures of some of the women who are supported by the organization. This woman is Rose, a very nice woman who made a huge impact on me. She suffers chronic tuberculosis and is HIV positive. She lost her daughter to AIDS and is herself forced to keep her condition a secret, even from her closest family members, for fear of rejection and persecution due to the stigma attached to HIV in Ghana. This is Alimatu. Like Rose, she is also HIV positive. In fact, when I took this picture, she was suffering through the final stages of AIDS. And like Rose, she also kept her status a secret from her family members. She died soon after I took this picture. These pictures were also instrumental in raising money for a fundraising campaign I set up to buy beds for the women who are supported by the organization, who until then slept on the cold, bare ground. These are some of the pictures I took before and after they received their beds. It was during this project that I really started to understand and appreciate the potential of my own photographs to raise awareness of an issue, in this case, the plight of vulnerable women living with HIV in rural communities. Following my work in Ghana, I knew by then that I wanted to focus more on taking pictures of people and to use photography as a tool to tell stories and to raise awareness of issues such as health, humanitarian crises, with a particular focus on women's issues. However, I hadn't yet figured out how to turn my passion into a financially viable profession. So I continued to travel and work with horses around the world in many beautiful places, such as Alaska, Canada, Australia, Malaysian Borneo, South Africa, and Mozambique. And then I captured this quirky image of a camel yawning in front of the pyramids of Giza, and it became a very unexpected turning point in my career. This picture was published in National Geographic magazine, which was a dream come true, and it gave me the encouragement I needed to bite the bullet and follow my dream of pursuing a full-time career as a professional photographer. But why photojournalism? At university, my studies were largely focused around global policy making. And since then, I'd always felt drawn to try and see for myself the realities on the ground for the people affected by the policies and conflicts I'd studied. So I decided that photojournalism was the field of photography I wanted to focus on. A very different path to the more conventional and less risky path of wedding or family photography I think my parents might have preferred I pursue. After a few freelance assignments with local newspapers in Wales, I traveled to Palestine, where I began producing photo essays about the struggles of daily life faced by Palestinians living under Israeli military occupation. This series of images aims to highlight some of those difficulties, especially the experience of children whose lives are impacted by restrictions on movement, checkpoints, watchtowers, tear gas, and the constant fear of confrontation with Israeli soldiers and settlers. This child was riding his bicycle through the streets of the old city of Hebron when Israeli soldiers carrying assault rifles rushed towards him. He and his friends tried to pedal away, but he was caught and detained. Despite having committed no crime, he was detained and his bike was confiscated. These are just some of the injustices faced by Palestinians on a daily basis. From Palestine, I returned to Europe to cover the ongoing refugee crisis and its widespread humanitarian implications for thousands of people fleeing war and persecution. For the next few months, I visited camps across Greece and the unofficial camp known as the Jungle in Calais, France. There I met people who had been living under extremely difficult conditions, stranded for months, often at odds with the compassion and safety they'd hoped to find amongst Europeans and their governments. As tensions rose, I photographed clashes between refugees and police as authorities forced the closure of the refugee camp in Calais. This photo shows a group of men who are carrying their makeshift home away from the area the authorities were clearing. I photographed similar scenes in northern Greece when their border with Macedonia was sealed, cutting off access to the Balkan route cutting off access to Western Europe via the Balkan route and trapping thousands of refugees in northern Greece. Inside the camps, I met many Kurdish and Iraqi families who had been displaced from their homes by ISIS. And it made me want to try and go and see for myself some of the horrors that were driving people to flee their homes and risk their lives trying to reach the safety of European shores. In December 2016, I decided to travel to northern Iraq, where the military offensive to liberate the city of Mosul was underway. I headed to Erbil, the capital of the Iraqi Kurdistan region, an entry point to Mosul. When I first arrived in Iraq, my initial plan was to cover the humanitarian crisis, spending my time in refugee camps and camps for internally displaced people. However, given how accessible the Frontline was from Erbil, I soon found myself in a car with 2 other photographers and a local fixer heading towards the battle. On my first trip to the field, we headed to a town called Gayara, which is south of Mosul, where several oil wells had been set ablaze by retreating ISIS militants. As we neared the town, the sky became blanketed by a vast, pervasive darkness, giving the whole area a dark, apocalyptic feel. These are some of my pictures of the firefighters who worked for several months to extinguish the raging flames. Despite their success in eventually extinguishing the fires, the poisonous gases had a lasting and devastating effect on both the civilian population and the environment. As local militias and Iraqi forces fought to liberate villages near Gayara, I joined a unit on the front line, moving forward with them as they drove ISIS militants out of a tiny village in the desert. With my cameras swinging around my neck and my helmet bobbing on my head, we ran with them from one abandoned house to the next, taking cover inside as bullets battered the walls around us. During my first few months in Iraq, my trips to the front line were largely focused on the mechanics of war and the military's advance into the city of Mosul. I realized, however, that I wasn't really getting the whole picture, and I wanted to find a way to tell the human story of the impact on the people of Mosul who were caught up in the crossfire. As the battle entered the densely populated and narrow streets of Mosul's old city, I had an opportunity to accompany a team of international medics who I'd heard were working just on the front line. The medics were operating out of makeshift field clinics, what they referred to as trauma stabilization points, or TSPs, moving forward as Iraqi forces liberated areas. The medic's job, of course, was to stabilize patients, to buy them some time to reach a hospital. One of the first things I was immediately struck by was how malnourished people were. I knew that people had been trapped for several months in Mosul's old city without access to enough food and water, but I really didn't expect to see this degree of starvation. This little boy, this is a 2-month-old baby called Suleiman, who is critically malnourished and clearly on the brink of starvation. Katie Batrouni examined the baby, but there wasn't much she could do other than send him straight to hospital for further treatment. Some of the people I met at the clinic really had an impact on me, and this woman, for example, Nadia, made a huge impact on me, and I'll just never forget her face. It's not a particularly good picture, but the story behind it has a lot of meaning to me. When she arrived at the clinic, she had an enormous blast wound to her back and side. The wound was so big that I was sure that the person was either already dead or about to die. I took a couple of quick pictures of the medics dressing the wound, and then I moved around to see her face. Her eyes were closed, so I took her hand in mine, hoping perhaps naively to offer some comfort. As I did so, she opened her eyes, looked directly at me, and with a big smile said in perfect English, "Hello, my dear. I'm so happy. We're free now. We're safe. I'm so happy." In this picture, she's reaching out to thank Katie, the paramedic who treated her, as she's being wheeled out to an ambulance. The next picture shows part of her injury, which is quite graphic, so if you'd rather not see it, please look away now. Another woman I met at the clinic, who had sustained an injury to her face, cried with relief to finally be free. She said to me, "Today is our birthday because it's the first day we're free." Her 2-year-old son had been killed in the fighting a day earlier. Documenting the work of the medics, who were part of an international medical organization called Global Response Management, as well as the rescue teams and the soldiers who risked their lives to carry casualties from the front line to the clinic, was, of course, an intense and emotionally challenging experience, and one that certainly gave me an intimate and unforgettable insight into the harrowing human cost of conflict. These are some pictures of the rescue workers. I was especially inspired by the strength and resilience of the female medics who I photographed and watched in awe for several weeks as they worked day and night, saving lives while risking their own lives. I wanted to come back to this haunting image of the baby Suleiman, who was tragically close to death when he was brought to the clinic in Mosul. 2 years after I took this picture, and just less than a week after I left Iraq, I received a message via Facebook from an Iraqi doctor asking if this was my picture. Mohammed, a doctor who had been working at the displacement camp where Suleiman was taken, wanted to let me know that he had worked tirelessly for months to help keep the infant alive, and he wanted to tell me that Suleiman had survived and was now in relatively good health. I was then able to return to Iraq from Wales to meet Mohammed and to go to the camp to see Suleiman with his mother. Here he is in 2019 in a camp near Erbil. The battle against ISIS in Mosul took a devastating toll on the city's residents, killing between 9,000 to 11,000 civilians, according to an AP investigation, and injuring thousands more. Amid such unimaginable human tragedy, I think photography is so important in confronting the viewer with the raw reality and horror of war, putting a face to a crisis or a conflict, and serving as a reminder of our common humanity, yet disparate fates. Amid the heart-wrenching scenes of trauma and loss, there were some surreal moments of joy, triumph, humanity, and support from the medics, the soldiers, and also some of the residents of Mosul. One family in particular showered us with kindness and hospitality, cooking us meals each night and welcoming us into their family home. This picture shows a moment of celebration when a team of bomb disposal experts of Iraq's special forces successfully detonated 2 improvised explosive devices that were found planted right outside the mosque the abandoned mosque where we were based. After victory was declared over ISIS in Mosul, the country began the long and difficult process of recovery and rebuilding the lives and infrastructure that had been destroyed. As the mainstream media attention was diverted to other areas, prompting the majority of photojournalists and reporters to leave, I decided to stay in Iraq and continue covering the equally important post-conflict story of recovery and rebuilding. From September 2017, in addition to my photojournalism work, I contributed as a photography consultant to the United Nations Development Program in Iraq. My task was to capture images and photo stories that highlighted the impact and progress of UNDP's projects in areas affected by ISIS across the country. From the old city of Mosul to the desert of Western Anbar, I met and photographed many families and individuals determined to recover from the trauma of ISIS occupation and the battle for liberation. Over the course of the following 2 years, I documented the positive change brought about by UNDP's projects, many of which were generously funded by the UAE, focusing on the restorations of schools, like this one, and hospitals. This hospital was completely in ruins when I first visited it, and now it has state-of-the-art operating theaters. They also restored housing, small businesses, roads and bridges, water and electricity systems, and empowered women and men to take an active role in rebuilding their towns and cities through temporary work initiatives. And we're back to horses. It's a funny thing about my life. Wherever I go, even in a war zone, I always find myself surrounded by horses, and Iraq, of course, was no exception. In stark contrast to the scenes of war and devastation I was photographing in Mosul, I also had the very unexpected opportunity to photograph and ride some incredible horses in Erbil. Just a couple of hours' drive from the war-torn streets of Mosul, the Erbil International Equestrian Club was hosting glamorous show jumping events, which I was invited to photograph and also take part in, which is something I hadn't done since my youth. I also had the chance to photograph their increasingly popular horse racing events as part of a national campaign to promote the sport throughout northern Iraq. After almost 3 years living in Iraq, I decided that it was time to say a sad and reluctant goodbye to the country that I'd grown very fond of, and to start looking for new stories in a completely different context. The time felt right to start working on a long-term personal photography project I'd been wanting to pursue for many years that draws on my background and affinity with horses. The project is an in-depth look at the relationship between horses and the people whose livelihoods depend on them. To kick off the project, in October 2019, I traveled to Mongolia to meet and photograph the iconic Kazakh eagle hunters, horsemen, and semi-nomadic people of the Altai Mountains. Traveling to Mongolia was a lifelong ambition, and I set out to capture a collection of images that offer an artistic but accurate expression of the traditional way of life of these people. with the rapid rise of urbanization and the increasing threat of climate change affecting Mongolia's rural populations, it was really a privilege to spend time with families who continue to live off the land in an extremely harsh environment. In the rugged Mongolian countryside, despite the differences in the surroundings and the scope of the challenges faced by the people I met, I somehow found a connection with the horsemen. And through our shared affinity with horses and the common language that creates, I was reminded of my childhood in Wales, where my days were spent in the saddle, enjoying the quiet, natural beauty of my surroundings, and always with a hot cup of tea waiting for me at the end of the day. In contrast to the scenes of conflict and suffering I photographed, projects like this one in Mongolia present an important opportunity to document a way of life that's likely to look quite different in years to come, and to capture what I find to be a common thread of the human struggle to not only survive, but to build a better and more secure future for oneself and family, be that in situations of violent conflict, occupation, refugees fleeing towards hope, or nomadic people subsisting on what many would consider meager resources. Like many of life's journeys, the meandering path often winds its way back to where it began, symbolically if not physically. And for me, horses have never been very far from my path. Having the opportunity to combine my love of horses with my passion for photography allows me to stay connected with my roots and to always find that familiar feeling of home. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Claire, for your extraordinary commitment and your amazing courage. The irony is that Claire could spend so long in a war zone in Mosul and yet be very nervous about coming out and presenting to you. So thank you, Claire. Please join us again.